Hey everybody, it is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode of Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul, and back with another song that has just been haunting me for these past couple weeks, driving me crazy, on my mind day and night, and I couldn't take it any longer, and I knew I had to bust it out here and play it for you guys and try to get this song off my mind once and for all, just for a few hours, maybe a break, right? Okay, so here's the quick backstory of this song, and then we're going to jump right into the music. So, a couple weeks ago, I was thinking about 80s music, right? And I was just letting my mind sort of wander about 80s music. And somehow the name Flock of Seagulls passed through my brain, or maybe I saw a reference to them somewhere, or I heard a song or something. But somehow a flock of seagulls popped into my head. And of course, I made that instant association, like most of you probably did just now when I mentioned the name of the band, A Flock of Seagulls. The first thing you probably thought of was, "And I Ran," right? So did I. I thought of that song first. And then I started thinking of songs that I could potentially play on the channel by Flock of Seagulls, because I knew they had other hit songs and other songs that I liked, in addition to, of course, their most popular big hit song, "I Ran." Okay, so I started sort of doing a very quick mental inventory of A Flock of Seagulls. And I pulled up my personal playlist here to see what I had, and I only had a couple of their songs. And so I was doing this mental inventory, and I was going, okay, I know there's "I Ran," and then I know there was a song called Space Age Love Song that was a hit after "I Ran." And then I thought to myself, I remember there was another big hit that they had, which is a song called "Wishing If I Had a Photograph of You." And those were the three songs that my mind instantly went to, that I thought, okay, I can name those songs and I can hear the hooks of those songs in my head. I'm familiar with what they sound like. That's what I made the association. And then, so very quickly, I just clicked on those songs. I didn't need to click on "I Ran" because I had already heard that. So just to refresh my memory, I clicked on a Space Age Love Song, and then after that, "Wishing If I Had a Photograph of You." And as I was listening to both of them, I kept waiting for certain things to happen in the songs, and those things were not happening. And then it occurred to me, after I listened to both of those songs, that there was another song out there that I had forgotten about from A Flock of Seagulls, because I realized that I just sort of had a weird mental connection that the sounds I was expecting to hear came from one of those two songs, a Space Age Love Song or "Wishing." And while I did recognize both of those songs when I played them, the fact that there's certain things I was expecting never happened, I realized there's something else. Okay, I'm not confusing these songs. I'm actually thinking of a different song. And then I started thinking, well, what was the other song? And I couldn't come up with a name for that fourth big hit song that Flock of Seagulls did that I thought, memorized. So here's what I found out. So I did some research, right? Okay, 1982, March of 1982, Flock of Seagulls explodes onto the scene with a song called "I Ran." Number 9 hit in the US, not bad at all. Top 10 right out of the box, that's pretty great. Number 8 on the dance chart and number 3 on the rock chart. Okay, that is a smash across the board. Great job. They follow that up, same album. Next single is, in fact, Space Age Love Song. That's just a few months after "I Ran" in the spring of '82. That one doesn't quite do as well as "I Ran." It gets up to number 30 on the US chart, number 34 over in the UK. But another hit and another recognizable tune by A Flock of Seagulls. They follow that up with their next album. So this is now their third hit, released in 1982. In November of '82, they release the aforementioned "Wishing If I Had a Photograph of You." And that turns out to be a pretty nice hit for them. Gets up to number 26 on the US chart, number 3 on the rock chart, and a top 10 hit over in the UK, released in November of '82. As I said, that's "Wishing." And that's where I thought the Flock of Seagulls story ended until I had this situation come up where I was confused about which songs were which titles and all that. And that's when I realized there was another song that came later, was not as big of a hit, only got up to number 56 on the US chart. Number 10 on the rock chart is a pretty good showing, and number 26 over in the UK. And that was from July of 1984. And that was this song. And I had remembered the song. I'd remembered the music. I remembered the vibe. I remembered the way it made me feel. But I totally got messed up remembering the title. And so I was thinking that various parts of this song, the actual track recording of this song, I kept thinking that various aspects that were lodged in my mind from this song were actually parts of either Wishing or Space Age Love Song, and they weren't. And so I was thrilled to discover that there's a fourth great Flock of Seagulls song that I knew I loved, and I just don't know how I somehow lost that connection to the title. But this is it. The more you live, the more you love. So when I realized that this song was out there and there was this fourth missing big hit from Flock of Seagulls, of course, I went and got their greatest hits CD. And when I put this on, I could not believe it. This was the one that had been haunting me all along. And there it was. And I just couldn't remember the title. But I got it now. The more you live, the more you love. And in hindsight, here's another artist and another sort of mini catalog here, these four hits by Flock of Seagulls. This is another artist that all these years later, I sort of hold their sound and their place in the 80s pop rock schemata. I sort of hold it in a little bit different perspective than I did back in the day when it was actually unfolding in real time. But I'll tell you more about that after we hear the song. Let's hear this groovy song. This thing has just been haunting me, and I mean literally for weeks. I can't get it out of my head, and I can't wait to just blast it right now and get all the way into it. Maybe that will help blow it on through. Let's see what you think. From July of 1984, it is a Flock of Seagulls. The more you live, the more you love. A Flock of Seagulls from the summer of 1984. The More You Live, the More You Love. That is from their third album, Story of a Young Heart. Now, here's the interesting thing about Flock of Seagulls, all these years later, right? And I didn't really think about this. This was not my certainly not my perception of them at the time, experiencing that part of their career success there in real time back in the 80s. So they bust on the scene there in 1982 with Iran. That's a big hit, right? They followed up with Space Age Love Song. Wishing I Had a Photograph of You is 1982 as well. So right out of the gate, 3 hits that first year, right? Then it's 2 years later, they come back with their third album, which has this song, The More You Live, the More You Love. So a pretty compact time frame that we're talking about, and a pretty compact set of hit songs here that they sort of made their career on, right? Here's the interesting thing, though. And let's just take this last one here, The More You Live, the More You Love from 1984. I'm just thinking of sounds that got first introduced into our collective consciousness there through the music of the 80s. There's those certain iconic, stereotypical, quintessential 80s pop rock sounds that are embedded in our brains, right? And the Flock of Seagulls recordings here, these 4 songs in particular, are just chock full of these quintessential iconic sounds that are burned into our brains and that we associate directly to 80s pop rock, this sort of MTV era wave rock, right? Well, I think because their catalog was so relatively small and their career was so relatively short, maybe we tended at the time back there in the 80s when this was actually happening, maybe because Flock of Seagulls was not as prolific as some of the artists who came on the scene around that same time as they did in the early 80s, but then continued on and either had more success or bigger success or longer term success, whatever, right? Those bands and those other artists, sort of kept moving on and we kept going with them, whereas it appeared that Flock of Seagulls was sort of just isolated to this particular period of time and didn't push beyond that, right? But the interesting thing is those iconic sounds and so many of those stereotypical sounds, and I'll just name a couple of them right now. You got those big synthesized drums, right? Those big electronic drum sounds that just came to be synonymous with 80s pop, rock, wave, even in the soul arena. I mean, synthesized drums, electronic drums, everybody was using those damn things back there in the 80s, right? But not everyone was using them in 1982 and 1983 and 1984 when Flock of Seagulls was having this little mini run of success and of their hits there, right? That was not a super common thing right then. It did become a super common thing later, but it wasn't necessarily a super common thing right at that moment. And in conjunction with the other things I'm about to name, of course, the proliferation of the synthesizers, the keyboard synthesizers in the band. There's another 80s, just a stereotypical quintessential 80s thing, right? I mean, that's when the synthesizers really just came on the scene in such a big way and really influenced so much of the music in the 80s, right? And it seems like it's almost comical, but looking back on it, there was like a handful. The musical instrument manufacturers would say, "Oh, this synthesizer is capable of 12,000 sounds," and yet, as someone pointed out, I think it was David Lee Roth. Well, then how come I only keep hearing the same 3 sounds over and over, right on every record? Something to that effect. So there was the use of the synthesizers as the predominant keyboard instruments and getting away from the old 60s and 70s keyboard instruments that had been dominant, like either pianos or electric pianos or organs, some of the more traditional keyboard-based instruments that you would have heard in pop, rock, and soul. Getting away to that, now all of a sudden in the 80s there, the synthesizers are really taking over, right? And that became a part of that iconic 80s sound. And here's Flock of Seagulls not only doing it in the early 80s in conjunction with those electronic drums, but they're creating those keyboard and synthesizer synthesizer sounds that are not just the same two or three that you heard on every record. They've got some unusual, slightly unusual and quirky voicings and sounds coming from those synthesizers. So credit to them for that. The other thing, of course, is the guitar. The sound on these guitars is just fantastic on these Flock of Seagulls records. And this goes to not only the talent of the guitarist himself in the band, but from a production and engineering standpoint, the people behind the scenes that are creating the physical sounds that are going on to the record. And certainly the artist obviously has a lot to do with that. But in this case, just from an overall presentation of the sound, the way they use that guitar, the effects, particularly it's the effects on the guitar, the phase shifters and the choruses and the echoes and all the different effects, electronic effects that they use on those guitars, just creates such a larger than life sound, and it just creates so much ambiance and so much atmosphere. And it's in a completely different way. It doesn't sound like 60s or 70s rock guitar. It sounds like guitar from outer space, which is exactly what you would want if you were a Flock of Seagulls or one of these, young and hungry up and coming stars back there in the early 80s. You wanted something different, right? They didn't want the same old stuff from the 60s and 70s. So you get that just fantastic guitar sound that's just iconic all by itself, right? And the final musical element of it there on top, of course, is the vocals. And you get these just really cool, again, it's almost like otherworldly. This singer, this vocalist in Flock of Seagulls, it's almost like he's singing from outer space on every song. And it just gives it such a dimension to it. There's just dimension and space to it. To his vocals just sound like they're coming through the ethers at you, right? And penetrating right into your soul. And it's not that he's such a particularly gifted vocalist. He's just like so many of the other instrumental or musical aspects of their sound. He's a little quirky and a little different and a little off, right? A little off center, coming from a little bit different place vocally. But the lyrics combined with the way he delivers the vocal and that sound, they've created that sound with those elements, and you put it all together. And it's just... it's a shame that their career was not longer, and it's a shame that they only had this handful of hit songs. It's been 40 years since they bust on the scene there in 1982 with Iran, and then, as I said, Space Age Love Song, Wishing, and The More You Live, The More You Love. And what a cool sound. And now in hindsight, given the amount of incredible music, and this is the other thing that I think was a sort of played a factor in overlooking Flock of Seagulls and maybe not giving them the credit that they deserved back in the day. There was just so much great music coming out. I mean, you can't even imagine in the early 80s. In some ways, it was like the 60s and 70s were still happening because there was still a ton of great music just pouring out of the musical marketplace. And so it was easy, to sort of just slot people into slots and then sort of forget about them because you're just constantly being bombarded by great new music. So, I think maybe Flock of Seagulls didn't quite get the credit that they deserved at the time. But now, all these years later, just looking at those sounds that they created and how cool that sound still is. It is iconic and it may be stereotypical, but it is just such a quintessentially cool 80s sound that they created. And nothing did it to me like this one. The More You Live, The More You Love. God, and I can't believe when I figured out that this is what it was and I heard it and I cranked it that first time, I just wanted to cry. I couldn't believe I had found this song again. Summer of 84, man, what a time that was. Go back and look at some of the music that came out in 1984. You want to talk about a year in music. There was a whole lot of competition on the charts and in the music scene back then. And so, Flock of Seagulls may not have charted quite as high as they had previously or quite as high as some other artists new on the scene did, but still created quite a little trademark sound, I would say, from the early 1980s. A Flock of Seagulls. Let's see if that gets this song off my head for 5 minutes. See you in the next one, folks. Hope you dug that. What about the 80s, huh? Oh, my goodness. Survivor.